Let me share my screen so we can get started. Thank you also for sharing the poll, letting us know what if you're already part of the course, what you think about it so far. That's really, really helpful feedback. And we'll potentially be using that for other iterations of the course. So if everything is well, you should be seeing a yellow screen. Let me just check in the chat before I push myself away if that is truly the case. Okay, great. Perfect. Thanks everyone for being here. We're going to talk about Branding 101, which is the topic of the course. And the reason why I wanted to do this webinar is these courses, when they stand on their own, they can be a really good introduction to a particular topic, but you probably also have some questions that you might want to share with us, or you're looking for supporters, and all of the people who are taking the course could be your supporters. So we always say it takes a village to build a brand, and you guys could be that village for each other, and I'd love to be part of yours as well. So the learning goals for today is if you haven't started the course yet, is that you have a little bit more of an advanced understanding of what branding really is, how it can support social and environmental change. Also understand what's the framework underneath a brand, because I feel that a lot of us, it's always hard, like brand is very intangible, and we think that there's a structure underneath it, and that's what we teach in the Branding 101 course, and anyone in the world really can use that structure to build their own brand. And that's also what we try and encourage with the use of tools, is that people have the frameworks and information available to really apply the kind of thinking like a brand strategist to their own venture, their personal brand, a movement, or a charity. So for today on the agenda, we have a short introduction of my story, the story of the Philanthropy U course and the tools. I'll give you a short intro to branding, and then we'll spend hopefully some time doing Q&A for those of the who want to also join with questions in the chat or come live onto the screen with me. So first of all, yeah, my story. So you might have seen my name on the course, on the Branding 101 course. That feels like an overstatement because there were so many wonderful people from the Philanthropy U team who took the content that we've developed over the years and really made it accessible for the Philanthropy U audience. But I am the maker of the canvas and the person who collaborated with the PU team. My name is Anne Miltenburg. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and I spent a good chunk of my adult life living abroad. Today, you're seeing me in Kenya. I've been in Kenya for about 7 years now. And it's always an interesting question, like, how did you become a brand developer specialized in brands for social change? And that's a bit of a backstory, but growing up, I was a pretty idealistic child. And, you know, at the age of 8, I became a vegetarian. I wrote school papers about apartheid. I was kind of that goody to choose a two-shoes child. And I chose to become a designer because I thought I could add something meaningful to the world through my profession. And I graduated on a project on communication around HIV/AIDS in Mali. And while being there, I grew pretty disillusioned with the development aid space. I saw the complexity of it, and especially in the area of the communication side of things, I thought there was a lot of smoke and mirrors that I was unprepared for. So when I came back to the Netherlands, I was offered a job at a brand agency, and I took that opportunity with both hands. And so over the next 12 years, I worked for big companies like Philips, but also charities like the Red Cross. And I really enjoyed that work because the ability to see inside all of these different organizations and learn what makes them tick was just amazing. It's like this free pass to all these different organizations, and thinking with them, like, how can we get to the outside world, like what you're all about, what you do, and really represent you well to the world. But after 12 years of that work, I really did miss that social engagement, even working for charities. And I started thinking about, well, what can this profession of mine really add to the world? Because I was growing quite increasingly despondent about the state of the world. And I'm pretty sure people in this audience would agree with me, but there's a lot of bad news, right? And that started to haunt me. So climate crisis, unemployment, inequality, and yeah, would lay awake about these things at night. But then the good news was that I also saw an incredible amount of people who were putting their shoulder to the wheel, who were working to create change in all these different areas. And that really got me inspired to get out of bed again in the morning. So people are working on concepts in justice, food security, healthcare, jobs. And in a perfect world, of course, these ideas would kind of spread purely based on their own merit. But it's not a perfect world. And so what we were seeing is that a lot of these amazing ideas for change were failing to really grow and attract enough of the right audiences at the right volume to be successful. And I asked myself, why is that? And so I realized that looking at a lot of the different brands into which these ideas were channeled, it's not necessarily not making it at that scale because the idea, the product or service is no good, but because we are just like really failing to reach those audiences at the right volume, and brand is really a mechanism to do that. And I think that's because as society, we tend to invest like massive amount of resources into the development of ideas and products and services for change, but we invest relatively little in then selling them well to the world. And that's a great shame, because only when you're able to sell it to the world are you actually able to see the change that you want to see. And there are a lot of reasons why we don't invest in selling things to the world. And that's because we have dysfunctional beliefs, this idea that if you build it, they will come, or if it's a great product, it will sell itself. But unfortunately, like we only see that happen with like a fraction of commercial products, and social change and environmental change products are often even harder to sell. So I would argue that we need to invest as much effort into getting these ideas for change out there in the world as we are in developing them. And as a brand developer, seeing this happen over and over again, these ideas launched and then not coming to fruition, was frustrating. And I felt like what the world really needs is stronger brands for change, because what does brand really do? If you think about brands, in your life, brands that you might have in your cupboard, shoes you might have on your feet. What a brand does on the consumer side of things is brands create higher margins. So we all know, like the Nike effect, as soon as there's a Nike logo on something, you're able to charge more. It drives people's preference. So people prefer one brand over the other brand. And it also drives loyalty, so repeat customers. And those things are just as important for a human rights organization or a solar energy company as they are for a shoe company. And this is a very typical way of thinking about brands, so thinking about the consumer side. But what brand actually does on the inside of a company is almost even more interesting for me. So what does brand do for your team itself? So it allows you to hire better talent. So having a stronger brand, having people understand who you are and what you do and why it matters, and having followed your work just really helps to attract more people to your team. And that better talent is going to be really important when you need to compete with lots of other factors in the world. It also allows you to build stronger partnerships. So in Kenya, we would say elephants talk to elephants. That allows us to not only build stronger partnerships, but also negotiate better deals. And that's pretty amazing if you have small budgets, that you need the best deal that you can get. Then the third thing that I think is really important is that a brand gives you direction, where you want to go, and it really helps your team and your activity. So if you've ever been in an organization where it feels like you could go in 80 different directions, and that actually means that you're losing a lot of time because you're constantly like a little bit of peanut butter that's spread out over too many sandwiches, then that might mean that if you could be served by having a strong brand core so that you understand better, this is the problem in the world that we're solving. This is what the product or service is meant to do, and this is how we're all going to help make that happen. And the last but not least, it's easier to get investment. So having a brand that's known and loved is actually an asset on the books. So if you're looking to fundraise or you're looking for angel investment, all of those aspects can be helped by a stronger brand. So in 2014, I quit my job as a creative director at an agency called Interbrand. And I asked myself, how can I help create a world where a family starting a fair trade lemonade brand could rival a brand like Coca-Cola? And after a year of doing research and traveling all around the world, from Ireland to Zambia to Saudi Arabia, and speaking to all these different social entrepreneurs, we realized that we need to train change makers to think more like brand strategists. And that's what we've been doing over the past 7 years. You are working with the Brand Thinking Campus in the Philanthropy University course. So that was the first tool that we created, and we use it as part of workshops that we host all over the world at co-working spaces. But we also have events. We have a full book called Brand the Change that captures the full brand building process, so beyond the framework. And we have an online community. And so it's spun a bit out of control. And it's really lovely to also work with organizations like Philanthropy U or Acumen or Amani to help bring this method into more people's hands. And so, I have the honor and pleasure of spending my days training people such as yourself to think more like brand strategists. Tamar, I see you raised a hand. If you want to share the question in the chat, and then I'll make sure to get back to it in the Q&A part. So I first want to, if you're on this call because you're thinking about building your brand and you haven't started yet, think about what thinking like a brand strategist could do for you. I know that there's a lot of us who have also some need a little bit of extra courage, maybe, to step out into the world and to really represent what we want to see as a change. And giving yourself the permission and thinking about what's the best that could happen if I sold myself well can sometimes give you that courage to look beyond yourself, to put yourself out there in the world. And I'd love to also hear in the chat if you want to share what is the best that could happen to you if you sold yourself well. So I have a better understanding of what are all the different things that you're working on. So let me just do a quick branding 101, and I know that's also part of the course, but maybe it'll sound different when I tell you live. So when we think of branding, again, we often think of logos, we often think of really expensive advertisement campaigns, but we really see branding as a basic human thought process that helps you make decisions. So every day, you and we make decisions depending on where we live about which milk we might buy, whose Christmas recipe we will be cooking, which cancer charity you might want to support with your end of year paycheck, where would you go to make your will or your testament, which movement do you join to take action on climate change. And all of these different choices that you make are based on this archive of associations that you've built over the years, where you've heard something about Greenpeace, you've heard something about Extinction Rebellion, and those associations you store in your head until they're then later called upon when you have to make a choice. So what is branding then really? So the way that we define it for our training programs is branding is really directing how other people think and feel about you. And as a consumer, you're very used to being the subject. So you're used to being the person who's receiving all of the signals. But when this process is reversed and we have to build our own brands, it is often far more complicated because we're not used to being on the other end of that relationship. So this idea that you now have to direct how other people think and feel about you can be really quite daunting. So the way that people build associations is they might have seen your TED Talk, or they've talked to one of your team members, or they've interacted with your product or service, whether that's an app or it's a physical product like a type of ground flour. They could have read an article about you in the press, or heard a recommendation from a friend. They might have seen an ad. They've been to one of your events. These are all interactions that kind of sow a seed for how you're perceived. And if you want to build a strong brand, your job is to guide how all of those different experiences really build this one understanding in someone's head that says, like, yes, I want to buy that electric bicycle. I want to invest in that accelerator fund. I want to support that human rights organization. And if that process sounds really abstract, I totally understand. It's basically about answering 5 really simple but really hard questions. So it's about who you are, what you do, why it matters, who needs to know about it, and how they're going to find out. So at the core of the Philanthropy U course is this model called the Brand Thinking Canvas. And that's really based on looking at a brand as a human. So we really believe that brands are built like humans. We have a core. That's where our beliefs, our personality, our values, whether those are cultural or religious or otherwise, all of those things are on the inside. Then we have an outside layer. That's our brand identity. And that's how we speak. It's what we look like. And those really try, in many cases, we try and reflect what's important to us on the outside from within. And then there's brand interaction. So those are all the different interactions between you and your audience. And we took that kind of anatomy of a human put it into a model. So what you're seeing here is the model that's at the core of the Branding 101 course. And what we see is that there's a brand core. So this is really where you start to define, like, what's the world that you want to see? That's your vision. Your mission is how you're going to get there. The values are what drives your behavior, your actions, and then your brand promises is everything that you're committing to deliver. So having, as if you're making, let's say, your wedding vows to your customer, what are, let's say, the 8 different things that you are committing to? Then the question becomes, okay, well, how do you then translate that out to a visual and a verbal identity? So if you've ever been in a process where you're really lost as to what your logo should look like, or what kind of colors, or what type of tone of voice, that's probably because there hasn't been a really clearly defined brand core. So the identity is really translation of what's on the inside. And we'll look at an example in a minute. And then from that ring of identity, then we move outward. So what does that core mean for all the different interactions? So that means how does your mission translate to a particular product or service? Where do you want to be seen in terms of places or events that you might yourself develop? What are the types of communication and channels that you might use? What are the partnerships that will lift you up? What are the people that you will put in the spotlight, or what's the technology that you can leverage? And this is part of a bigger process, this tool, but I just wanted to share with you an example and from a fictional organization called Mama Code that we work on during other training programs. And I'll share my screen here. I don't know if you guys know this tool. It's a digital whiteboard called Miro. And what you see here is a brand framework for an organization called Mama Code. They are training mothers to become expert coders with a 1-year programming course and a mentoring service. So let's take a look at the center of this model. So the vision, mothers in tech careers nurturing future-ready families. So Mama Code wants to see mothers established in tech careers. How are we going to get there? That's the mission. We train mothers to become expert coders. And the 4 values that Mama Code has chosen that really guide their behavior is professionalism, collaboration, and relentless optimism. And we'll see how that plays out on the outside later. And then the brand promises. So these are, let's say in this case, I think there's about 12 specific promises that they're making, that they're committing to as if it's a wedding vow. So you'll get world-class coding courses and mentorship tailored to the needs of mothers. There's a support system of women like you with shared experiences. There's easy to understand materials and great teachers. When you're future ready, your children will be too. Get 3 years of career coaching, etc. So what you see is there's a specific set of promises that you're committing to, that you're going to use throughout your communications and throughout your product development that are going to guide how people are going to experience this brand. Then if we're thinking about, okay, well, how does that translate? So for instance, this idea of, let me go to the verbal identity, relentless optimism. So the tone of voice, for instance, that was developed for Mama Code is one of encouragement and positivity. So they, as a brand, would like to channel a little bit of that Oprah Winfrey vibe. So I'm not sure if you all know Oprah Winfrey. I know she's famous in specific countries, but American talk show host and amazing businesswoman who's so famous for giving away cars on TV shows, amongst other things. You get a car, you get a car, you get a car. So Mama Code wants to incorporate that kind of relentless, optimistic, and encouraging tone. If you want to help mothers who are currently in low-paying jobs into coding careers, then you need to have tech explained in really human terms. So it's understandable. The benefit to women and the benefit of their careers is immediately clear. And even though there is a huge gender gap in the tech space, Mama Code says that we want to talk about solutions and don't dwell on the problems long enough. So then on the other end, how might the visual identity of Mama Code look like? So for instance, they will build portraits of women completely built out of code. There'll be this combination of feminine meets tech, so bold colors and type. And the photography will feature images of successful moms in the workforce and teaching their kids. Then how might, what could the interactions look like? So first of all, the product and the service. So there is a 1-year in-person and online coding program, and then there's a job matching and 3 years of career support. It's really important to see the product as an outcome of the brand rather than the brand representing the product. The places. So when we're thinking about, for instance, creating classrooms where these courses are taught, Mama Code really wants to show this professionalism, like, hey, you're on the road to success by having really high quality hardware and interior design to show like this is not just like your library coding course. This is really one step towards a career. And also to tailor the program to the needs of mothers. That means that all the classes that they are holding are close to primary and secondary schools for those mothers who come in and out to drop the kids. Now, how might they be using their communication and channels? So for instance, the first stage, while they're getting set up, they'll use Instagram, for instance, to share in an accessible way what coding is, what it means for your career and family. And in the second stage, share the stories of participant success. The way that they might be reaching new audiences is, for instance, by advertising on blogs on parenting and motherhood. And those ads all have to do with the stories of the mothers who've gone through the process successfully. Then, for instance, the partnerships and collaborations. So they aspire to work with an organization like Lean In, which is the organization started by Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook. They want to have male and female tech leaders as ambassadors to employees. They would be best positioned, for instance, to raise investment from successful women entrepreneurs in tech. They might be a great match for an organization like Salesforce Foundation. And so finally, the last type of interaction. So who is going to be the face and the voice of your brand? So in this case, for Mama Code, they know that, for instance, the founder, Jane, is the best example of a mother who learned how to code. So that's someone they're going to consistently put in the spotlight. And they're also going to invite in the best mentors from the coding scene who can really understand, who can speak to this idea of making complex things easy to understand and setting a welcoming tone for the whole experience of coming into the brand. So I hope this gives you a bit of an idea, besides the material that is in the current course, of how you might use this tool, not just to capture what you're already doing, but also really to push this idea of like, what could my brand be? And really use it as an ideation tool and see if you can stretch it into the future. So think about all the things, think about brand as something that you set for a 3 to 5 year horizon. So make sure that you're shooting a little further than maybe you can currently reach, so that you that this basically becomes a guiding mechanism to get you to where you want to be. I'm just going to see, because I see a couple of hands and I'm sure there's a couple of questions. Yeah, so first of all, there's something about a book. That's true. This is not an event to plug a book, but I will share it with you nonetheless. So I will put that in the chat here. So the book is called Brand Change. That's where the main tool is from as well. And then I saw, let me see, I saw a hand up from Adam. I'm going to turn the sound on if you like. Adam, did you have a question? I'm not hearing you yet. You're muted.
I say sorry, I was listening and I was doing something. And when I touch
It's a bit hard to hear you, Adam. There's a lot of sound around you. Would you be able to go to a quiet spot?
yeah, I will ask the question later. Please continue. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. In the meantime, I'll look at some of the questions in the Q&A. So, Michaela, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Do you have any advice how to persuade the funder of an NGO who does not believe in the importance of branding? Yes, lots of advice. So we tend to think that it's really important to address some of the, to not sell the product of branding, but sell the problems that it's solving. So for instance, if you would be able to discuss with a funder, well, what would it do for us if, for instance, more people knew about us when we walked in the room? So what would it mean, for instance, for our ability to fundraise, our ability to get support and partnerships? Or what would it mean for instance, the amount of beneficiaries that would come onto a program if they've heard good things about something? So there is, I think, quite a lot of dysfunctional belief that brand is indeed like advertising, but we really see it as bringing the like, let's say the good reputation that you hopefully already have, bringing that to more people and allowing that to do some of the heavy lifting for you. So to give you one example, there is an organization from the UK, a cancer charity organization, that by repositioning themselves more clearly were able to triple the amount of volunteers they were able to get involved in supporting people living with cancer. And I think that is a very good example. So we have in the book that I just shared, we have a lot of case studies of how founders have used branding. And that's another tip that I would definitely have. As a brand person, I am often asked to persuade founders and funders that this is important, but have other founders and funders speak to that definitely helps. And another tip is there's a TED Talk, and I'll look it up for you at the end of the session. And it's called The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong, I think by Dan Plota. I can Google it. I don't know if in the meantime, Adam has found a quiet spot. Think about charity is dead wrong. Yeah. Okay, I'll share this link in the chat. And I think he's another person that that I think is very convincing. So definitely take a look at that one. Yeah, and then I think also, so if you're interested, so we have an online community. I'll just share that link as well. If you're ever interested in exchanging more specific challenges around getting funders or founders to create a business case, you'll find articles within this community. And I think if you search for the term how to build the business case for branding, then you'll find it. So yeah, I'll type that in the chat too. Cool. How's your sound situation going, Adam? Adam is off. Okay. Abiola, the slides will not be shared, but I'll share a link to this presentation. So you basically have the entire talk on repeat as often as you want. Patria, how do you logistically allocate people and resources for branding in a startup who is still prioritizing executing its core product and services? I can't have a dedicated branding team, which means some people needs to do branding in addition to their core function. Okay, that's a very interesting one. I'm gonna take, I don't know if this is gonna answer your question, but it's one of the 5 tips that I wanted to share during this talk anyway. So let me just go there right now. Share screen. You're going to see me for a second, and then you're going to see the 5 tips. Yeah. So Patria, your question is in here. So one of the 5 things that I always want to kind of end the talk with is I think we are overly focused within the social impact space on this big why, but we often forget to articulate really well what is the what. So what's the actual product or service? So I sit in hundreds of presentations each year of amazing change makers, and very often I'm like, yes, amazing, let's eradicate poverty, or let's get this global energy transition started, but I don't really know, like, but what do you offer that I can say yes to? And so that ability to be really clear about what it is that you offer and what it is that you want people to say yes to, that's really part of a brand. If people don't know what it is, it's really hard for them to buy into that. And that seems really straightforward, but you'd be surprised how often that's an issue. We'd also really advise to get to know your audience and what matters to them. In the social impact space, we are also quite often very focused on the bigger issues, and we forget that we're talking to people who have a lot of other things on their plate. And so one of the complexity that you're needing to solve is that in normal business, you have a problem for a group of people. For instance, let's say, I'm gaining weight, I'm out of shape, well, aha, someone came up with the idea to create gyms. So this is a product or service idea to address that that sense of fitness that people are looking for. And now we're going to sell these gyms to people that want to get fit. But in the social impact space, what you often see is that there's a big problem in the world. We have an idea of how to address it. And now we're going to sell it to a group of people who isn't necessarily aware of or connected to that problem. So, for instance, in the world of plant-based alternatives to meat, a lot of meat eaters around the world enjoy eating their meat. They are not necessarily interested in arguments around sustainability of raising livestock. And so selling a vegan burger is going to probably be more successful if you're talking about taste and health rather than if you're talking about sustainability. So understanding who you're speaking to and what the arguments are that are going to get them on board is really important. And to the question of Patria, so I would say invest as much time in growing your brand as you do in developing a great product or service. So when you're in a startup, what you often see is that we're building this great product or service and change, and once it's done, we're going to find the audience. And that's a pretty standard way of operating, but I would argue, well, actually what you need to do is do both at the same time, and it'll make for a better product or service. And so when you're thinking, for instance, about, let's say, you're building a game for wildlife conservation. So you're trying to get people interested in this really complex question of like, how do we keep biodiversity in place? So as you're thinking about concepts for that game, you can already find a first audience of testers, learn more about them, get their feedback on the first prototypes of the app. You can also start to understand where would these people be so that we can get not 10 testers on board, but 100. And now as you're growing your product, you're also at the same time learning how to market to your audience. And that's incredibly important, because if you have used all your finances just to build that product, you're going to end up burning through a whole lot of investment and not having learned anything about how to market it when you get to the end of it. If you would have to say, well, how could I get like money or resources allocated to people who kind of have it in addition to their core function, I would say, can you label someone on your team, for instance, as a customer advocate or as a customer growth researcher, so that they look at the development of the product and the testing of the product as a way also to build the brand. I don't know if that is an answer to your question, Patria, but I definitely think that could be a helpful way to look at that one. Let me see if there's anything. Perfect. Okay, good. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, and so I'd be curious. I see there's no other questions in the Q&A, but is there anyone who has anything else listening to the story, like, but you know, what you're telling me, for instance, doesn't really apply to me because my situation is entirely different, or it's always interesting to hear some of the problems people are facing or challenges that they have that I might not be aware of. Let's see. Philippa. Oh, excellent question. You're taking my brain to the gym. So branding seems to be more focused on the value of the brand, which we can inform and sell to the users, while marketing focuses on finding the market needs and then create solutions. Yeah, well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So I definitely think, like, I think the brand is really the driving force for the organization, and marketing is really the way in which you put the product into the market. What we like to see is that they are linked in the sense that they're driven by a common set of values. So for instance, here in Kenya, we're currently seeing a huge flood of small credit loan apps. And a lot of those have some pretty terrible customer conditions, so they can be quite abusive in their terms. So we really think that for instance, if some of these brands are really truly driven by this idea that giving people financial power is a way to help them lift themselves out of poverty. So for instance, what are ethical ways to market? So if you're, for instance, tapping into this sense that, get a loan quick today because you need to pay your rent, or get a loan for a pair of shiny shoes, that's not very ethical set of marketing principles. So we really like to see like an integration of the brand with the way that it's put in front of users. So I think it's especially important with products and services that are trying to do good in the world, that also the avenues through which they're marketed don't actually add to the problem. Then let me think, another example. So what we, for instance, also see with when we're using the canvas is traditionally there's always this focus of like, how can I sell, for instance, a product to consumers? And what we see with really good like marketing thinkers is they'll come up with like, what's the most effective way that we can get this brand into the hands of more people? So for instance, if you have an online education offer, so here in Kenya, we have, for instance, some budding online marketing courses for young marketeers. So that this really supplements, for instance, the the university offer that is quite far behind in terms of content on content marketing. So how could you, for instance, not just interest consumers, so young learners in acquiring some of those skills, but could you actually sell it back to universities who currently don't have that as a curriculum? So thinking about marketing through the lens of brand and using that kind of marketing efficiency thinking, the universities could actually end up being on the list of partners. Yariel, is it normal to improve? No, mix it up, please do. Is it normal to improve or even change your offer services to match it with what our audience currently needs or wants? Well, I guess I don't know whether normal is something that I would label it as, but I definitely see that it happens. And I think depending on the type of organization that you are, you can choose to do that or not. So what happens sometimes is you've had a big insight, like you've had this total light bulb moment of, let's take the example of Mama Code, like, hey, we have mothers, especially single mothers who are stuck in really low paying jobs. There's a huge gender gap in the tech industry. So let's train more mothers to get into coding jobs. We're going to start with, for instance, an online course. And what we realize in the testing of the brand is that, first of all, mothers don't like to be addressed as mothers. So mothers themselves have a bias that a coding course for mothers can't be good. So you shift your focus and say like, okay, well, we're not marketing to, it is for mothers, we're not marketing to them, we'll talk about busy women instead. So now your brand is kind of focused on like, okay, let's get busy women into coding careers. Now what you're seeing is that, okay, well, we started teaching them how to code, but actually what we see is not just about coding, it's about professional presentation, it's about networking. And so you're expanding kind of the offer that you need to have in order to get your audience into that tech career. So I would say all of those things are quite logical progressions and steps as you're kind of fine-tuning your road towards impact. Now, I would say, like, what if you, for instance, found out, like, well, a lot of men are coming to us and saying, like, I'm a single dad, can I be part of this? And then you could choose to say, like, yes, let's open up and make this for everyone. And that really depends on also where your funding probably is coming from. So is this self-financed? Who are the people who are funding it? Does that fit the guidelines, etc.? So now let's say we have a school for all. Is there, for instance, maybe all of a sudden a need for a entirely different type of training? Let's say business skills. And would you be overstretching yourself by saying, okay, well, as Mama Code, we're now also going to have fathers and men in the program, and we're also going to train business skills because there's a huge demand. And then the question is, well, is that going to be a stretch in terms of credibility? So yes, and maybe it's an opportunity you can jump on short term, but does it actually harm you long term? And I think that's where strategic planning probably would come in. Like, what's the strength? What's your weakness? What's the opportunity and what's the threat? Spreading yourself wider makes you more appealing to more people, but also now you're competing with a lot more different organizations. So making those types of trade-off decisions, I think, is worth a really good conversation with your team and your leadership, whether you're willing to do that or not. I hope that's an answer, Yariel. Christian, how do you assess the strength of a non-profit brand? Well, we would say any brand. I'm just going to take a little cheat sheet because we were just talking about this today. So we assess usually a brand on 5 different factors. So that's clarity. So how clear is it what the brand does or offers, for who it is intended, and whether it's clear to that audience or not. Then there's how compelling is a brand. So are people really drawn to it? Are they, is it sticky, so to speak? Is it memorable? So does it, after hearing about it, can people, for instance, tell their friends about it in a way that makes sense, that that's correct, and that's simple to follow? Is it unique in the market? So for instance, we have the course we teach here in Nairobi, I always put 6 different development aid brands homepages on one sheet, and we cover the logos and we ask people to identify, like, hey, which nonprofit brand does each of these homepages belong to? And it's shocking how few people can actually tell them apart. And then trustworthiness. So do people trust you to deliver on what you promise? And that last one is, of course, super important, especially as there's quite a bit of competition amongst nonprofits. There's not a lot of, I think, well, when I teach, for instance, here in Nairobi, and people say, like, well, but we don't compete with anyone, we're nonprofit. And then I always say, like, okay, well, but you're competing for people's time, for people's attention, for funding. If you're competing, for donations, you're definitely in a very tight space. So trustworthiness is a really important one, and you can test this by speaking to your different audiences and asking simple questions. So you could, for instance, just take a folder to an event and just have a casual side chat with someone, like, oh, how would you explain what you do to when you come home tonight to your husband? Or would you recommend us to your friend or your boss? And then you get interesting feedback on some of these 5 different factors. Hope that helps, Christian. Kato, I'm much more interested in becoming the brand myself within an organization so that I can then externally build other brands. I think I need a little bit more context about that, but I do think that there is a big trend of, let's say, personal branding for intrapreneurs, so people inside organizations that build a brand for themselves so that they are more recognized for the work that they do internally, and that they are able to get more of the great work that they want to be doing. But I think this would probably merit a full conversation to understand exactly what you mean. So let me get back to that if we have time left at the end of the session. Is there specific metrics of branding to measure its effectiveness, Patria? Yes. So for instance, the way that we tend to think about metrics is, for instance, brand awareness, brand loyalty, and brand preference. So brand awareness is, first of all, are people aware of the fact that you exist? And you can find out by, for instance, asking people, what are all the different telephone companies that you know, if you're a telephone company? And what you would be looking for is to be quite high in that list. So if you are not on the list or you're very low, that's a sign that there's not a lot of brand awareness. Then, for instance, brand preference is, do people prefer you over other options? So for instance, if you had 20 bucks to donate to a cancer cause, which cause would you, or which specific cancer cause would you donate to, and why? So there's a lot of testing and conversation that needs to happen, and that's again something that I think branding immediately requires, is really close relationships with your type of audiences. And then loyalty is the sense that people keep preferring you over others and keep coming back to you almost to the point of irrationality. So we tend to think of this as like, oh, okay, you're talking about cigarettes or donations, but for instance, even for services. So I saw that a number of you are, for instance, solo entrepreneurs and consultants. So it's a really, that's a really competitive space. And if you've done all of the hard work to get one client on board, you really want that client to keep coming back to you, because it costs far less for you to keep that client in than it is potentially to get other clients to come in. For instance, brand loyalty, and how often does someone come back to you, even though they have lots of other options, potentially even at cheaper prices, is a really good metric of branding. Abiola, after using the branding canvas to answer the components contained in it, how do you present that output of the branding process to the client or organization that needed it? Yeah, so Abiola, I think your question kind of hinges on this idea that you create the canvas for an organization. I like to think of it as a co-creation tool. So yes, you can use it in a consultancy process where you create the canvas and you present it to them. But I would rather, personally prefer to create that canvas with an organization, because I think you, as an external, you cannot tell people, hi, this is your brand. So for instance, the values that drive their decision making and that drive their behavior, they simply cannot be set by someone on the outside of the organization, right? You want someone on the inside to have set those. You want that big vision to have been set by the people who are actually pursuing that day by day. And you, as a professional, if you're a creative consultant, for instance, you can help basically run people through this canvas in a workshop fashion, and then say, okay, well, we have roughly the outline, and now as a creative, I'm going to craft some of these answers so that they're a bit more polished or a bit more presentable to the outside world. I think that would definitely be much needed in many cases. What we, for instance, do is we advise clients, like, keep this canvas on your wall after we've done the workshop, so that you just have it as a constant reminder of this brand as a compass. So you could consider, for instance, okay, well, if you're gonna be a consultant and you present it, you can translate it just into a good presentation deck. You don't have to show the exact model, but you just visualize different elements. That could become the brand book in the long run. Yeah, consider seeing it as a co-creation tool rather than a consultancy tool. Rabia, how can I brand myself at a nonprofit organization as an employee? Excellent, really, really good one. Okay, so I think the first thing that's really important when we think about personal branding is that personal branding for me is really a way of helping to direct how other people think and feel about you. So having a good understanding of like, what's your expertise? What do you want people to come to you for? And so like, let's say, what is your personal mission within the organization? And how can you get as many people as possible and the right people to know like, okay, well, this is what I go to Rabia for, because this is what her expertise is. So I think that's definitely number one. So clarity on what your expertise is and clarity on where you want to go. I would pick those. I would definitely pick the mission part of the canvas as like the most important thing, and the brand promises. So what are you committed to delivering to your team, for instance? And other elements to think about is, for instance, if you're using the canvas as a kind of manifestation tool, what you could think about, like, what would be your dream project within the company? And maybe you're not yet like fully there yet that you could actually do that work, but you know that that's where you want to be going. So then you can use the canvas and say like, okay, well, if in 3 years I want to lead this really special project, what do I need to do in order to get to that position? And how do I need to present the work that I'm doing in such a way that people will actually recognize like, hey, this is the next step that we could invite her in for. I hope that is helpful too. So I've seen a lot of people we for instance, we've trained women in Saudi Arabia to use the canvas as a personal branding tool to position themselves on the job market, which was a really amazing way of seeing them, just the eye-opening effect of like, oh, no one has ever asked me where I want to be in 5 years, and now I have to articulate that, and was a really, really cool project. I think last question, Verlion. I found some NGOs are good in branding, but then we realize what they do so far are not really as impactful as their branding. Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. I'm sure that's the case. Are you still there? By the way, my power cut. In a few seconds, hopefully you'll get me back. Yeah, so it's very true that some NGOs are good in branding and actually don't have the impact to back it up. I would say that that's the exception. I would say 98% of NGOs are actually really, really bad at it and aren't at all doing justice to the amazing work. So if that's any consolation, from our research, it shows that it's an exception. So what if we only have a very tiny team who do all of the program development and branding? Yeah, I hear you. We have the same thing. So I run an education company where we have basically 3 people and 8 monthly events and 5 annual programs, and it's really tough. So I would advise, if you have a limited resources, which all of us have, is to make a really smart plan. So I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said, if I need to chop down a tree in 6 hours, I'm going to spend 4 hours sharpening the axe. So creating this brand framework will hopefully get top of mind for you. Like, okay, well, who's our audience? What do we want them to think and feel about us? And what are the ways that we can achieve that? And then picking from those different ways that you can achieve that, what are the most effective at doing that? So what's feasible with what's impactful? And what we often see is that when you start looking at, okay, what is the biggest thing that will move the needle is a really good way of prioritizing your different actions as a team. So I found that a lot of our communications tends to be busy work. And when we think about, okay, well, what of all the things on this list is the thing that's going to move the needle the most? Is that something that you can invest all of your or a lot more of your time in than doing some of the things that just kind of make their way into the to-do list, but aren't necessarily going to move that needle in terms of perception. Cool. We're at the end of the hour, but there's such good questions. I'd love to continue the conversation. So there's a forum on Philanthropy U around the course. You can reach out to me there. As I mentioned before, we also have a community on brandtochange.org where you can sign up. We have change makers of all different stripes there, founders, heads of marketing and communication internally, etc. There, and we have a huge tribe of brand professionals as well. So if you're looking for someone to collaborate, namers, creatives, etc., those are there as well. You can find me there. As I mentioned, there's a book, and yeah, I'll request Philanthropy U to schedule more of these talks so we can yeah, we can exchange more. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'll just share where you can find me, and I'd love to connect. And yeah, just as a last mention, I hope that you enjoy the Philanthropy U course. I think it's amazing that they make all of this content available for free. And there's a lot of courses in their library that I think are incredibly worthwhile. So for those of you who haven't started on the course yet, lots of luck. And thanks for coming and asking such amazing questions. I hope I've made sense. As I mentioned, I'll share the recording. So if you just want another listen, take a look. And then I hope you have a wonderful day, and hope to see you at another event in the future. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Rabia. Thanks, Paula. Thanks for Felipa. Nice to meet you. Yeah. Have a lovely day and stay safe. We're not out of the woods yet. Thank you for me. Bye.